think it's live. Hey, everybody. John Soriano here. And I want to just take a kind of a relaxing Saturday, as you can tell, um, to share some thoughts on mastery. And the reason this kind of came up for me was sitting watching a Bruce Lee documentary a little while ago. And I remember right around 16 or so was when I started really getting into martial arts on a more formal basis. And I first came across Bruce Lee's work, uh, the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. And I remember what struck me with it more than even the martial art part of it was his philosophy, uh, and that you could just tell you were reading the works of um, someone who's mastered themselves. And the more I studied that kind of material, I came across a book written by his top student, Dan Inosanto, which was called Absorb What Is Useful. That's the title of the book. Latte, by the way. A cigar and a latte. That's what I'm doing. All right. Now, Absorb What Is Useful, that book was like a thunderbolt to me because that philosophy of absorb what's useful, discard what's useless, and take what you've absorbed and make it your own has guided me literally in every field of endeavor, not just martial arts. And I use it even now. And as I was musing, I thought, am I really still applying absorb what's useful as a practice? Because nowadays, I mean, let's face it, I'm 52 years old. The body doesn't move quite like it did when I was 16. My martial arts techniques are quite a bit different than they were then. But overall, the practice continues. But I have to see, where am I going to apply this philosophy of mastery now? And it's a matter of the tools and techniques that I use now. So you just shoot there. In terms of the EFT, emotional freedom techniques, NLP, neurolinguistic programming, and hypnosis. So absorbing what is useful. Okay, you could take EFT. I mean, if you think about it, Gary Craig even did the same thing, right? He took, that's a lot of latte, all right. You're right, Richard. Gary Craig took thought field therapy and asked the magic question, right, which is really the guiding principle for absorb what's useful anyway. Mainly, what if? The what if question or the what if frame, right? So Gary Craig took the whole thought field therapy thing with all its different algorithms and the muscle testing and different the different ways of tapping depending on what you were working on, and said, what if I just tapped on all the points instead of worrying about which particular sequence to use? What if I just did that? And that's a whole mastery thing. That's a whole absorb what is useful thing, right? So as I sat and I contemplated, how am I applying absorb what's useful now? And I take EFT, for example, and I said, well, what if I use this nuance? And what if I use that nuance? And in NLP, I've used supposed techniques that were specific for a particular thing and used them in applications way off the spectrum. And they work. Because here's the thing about absorb what's useful, and this is how it starts to keep it all together. You need to look at the principles that guide what's going on, okay? So, for example, if I take the spelling strategy from NLP, right? And I say, okay, what else could I apply this principle to? The principle, of course, of the spelling strategy, if you're not familiar, is using a visual function to learn how to spell, okay? So taking that principle, where else could I apply it? So I actually applied it helping a student with biology I'm sorry, chemistry, using memorizing a formula and computation, an equation, chemical equation, right? Because the principle is the same. I was able to use the visual function, getting it through, going that whole route because I understood the principle of it, right? And I absorbed what was useful from it, and I was able to make it my own, and I was able to apply it elsewhere. Same thing when I'm using EFT with NLP. One of the topics I'll be presenting on at the virtual hypnosis conference in February. How do you use that within, say, a trance, right? And it starts with the magic question: what if I did blah blah blah, and what if I used blah blah blah, right? NLP, same thing, right? In fact, NLP, I remember when I was taking my master practitioner certification. One of the last criteria was to actually develop your own technique. And I like this. We're kind of like, it's like you and I are just kind of hanging out. I'm with my cigar and we're just having a fireside chat. I like it. So the thing was to develop your own technique, which is not, on the surface of it, it's like, oh, okay, well, I'll just throw this together. But it has to actually jive, and it had to work, right? And the only way it's going to do that is if you dig deep into principles and figure out how the principles are going to mesh, right? So going back to Bruce, I hope you're enjoying a nice, relaxing beverage as well. Going back to Bruce didn't just take different techniques of different martial arts and throw them together. He took them in terms of principle and how they went into the total paradigm of combat for him, right? So, for example, when he was taking kicking techniques from Taekwondo, for example, why did he do that? Because his original style of Wing Chun doesn't really have many. It has 2 or 3 primarily, and they're all below the waist, by the way. So if he wanted to add to that range, right? Because in principle, he's deficient in the long range, right? Which is the kicking range. So he had to say, okay, well, what could fill in the gaps here? What could fill in the deficits in principle? And that's why he added what he would add and did what he did. And I remember even in my early days of martial art practice, I would drive some of my instructors kind of batty with this because I was always of that frame after I started really getting taken by Bruce Lee's approach and his philosophy. It was like, well, why get stuck in a system? Which I always question my career choice to this day because I'm not really a systems guy, but I work in one of the worst systems there is. But I'm working on fixing that, right? So I would always kind of say, okay, well, what's the outcome I'm looking for, right? Because that's really what's going to be your second guide, the what if frame, but also what's your outcome? What is it you want this to do? And I remember once it was one of my kung fu instructors, and strict traditionalist he was, and I'm up against a guy who was a little bit more advanced than I was, and I couldn't really take an upper hand using the proper techniques, right? So I remember getting a little bit frustrated. I'm like, okay, well, this is kind of getting to me. I couldn't keep this guy off of me following the rules. So what do? You don't follow the rules. And I kind of baited him to come on in, and I just, bam, hit him with a right cross, which is not a traditional technique. And boom, there he goes. He hits the floor. He's on his back looking up at me. And I'm fairly pleased with myself. And my instructor was livid. He's like, well, what is that? I'm like, it's a right cross. Well, that's not Shaolin. I'm like, so what? I mean, the end result is this guy's on his back looking up. I mean, isn't that the point of the exercise? And, oh, no. I remember not to do that again. But, and it's kind of like that with all systems, isn't it? Right? You just they suppress the person to the point where it's just about the system, not about the people in the system. Right? Bruce Lee was real big against that. And that was another thing that always resonated with me. Um, those of you who follow me on Facebook, every once in a while I'll post a picture of Bruce Lee's tombstone that he had made. How's the saying go? Something along the lines of, in memory of a man who was smothered, or something along the lines, by the classical mess. All right, because he called systems the classical mess. So, and they are. So as I'm exploring, well, how am I applying the absorb what's useful stuff now? Um, when I'm with a client, a lot of times there'll be such a seamless blend of EFT and NLP and even aspects and principles of hypnosis, um, because that's absorbing what's useful by principle, and that's how it gets all together and it works, right? Um, and that's how, and that I think is something that is most important for mastery, is what if, and absorbing what's useful and making it your own. You don't just slap it all together and say, okay, well, this should be working now. It doesn't work like that. But you have to make it your own. Okay, do I do EFT like other practitioners? Probably not. Do I hypnotize like other practitioners? Probably not. Am I a neurolinguistic programmer like probably not, right? Because I'm not them. I can't be them. I don't try to be them, right? And whenever I studied, I remember I would watch my instructors, and they would demonstrate technique, and they would say, so execute the technique, right? And okay, we do that. But then as I'm practicing afterwards on my own, and I was relentless in my practice back then, by the way, kind of like now, I'm forever studying EFT books or NLP books or hypnosis books, and I'm constantly going through them in my head. I had the fever I had when I was a martial artist at 16. But when I would practice on my own after class, I would always take the technique and then break it down. Okay, this works, but why does it work? Why? Because that's going to be the key indicator. Why does this work? Because that, once you get the why, that's the principle. So why does EFT work? Why does tapping in this particular way work? Why does this particular NLP technique work? And NLP, by the way, is not techniques. It is not techniques, okay? Even Richard Bandler will be the first to say that, and he has said it. It's a philosophy that leaves a trail of techniques behind. So if you understand the why as to why the NLP technique works in a particular case, you'll be able to apply it in principle. All right. Same thing with hypnosis. All right. What is hypnosis? What is trance? Once you get to the principles of how this functions, you can use it in any other way. Does that make sense? So you have to just get to a point where you're digging deep, and those techniques I would remember, and even in when I furthered my training to what it is now, which is mostly the Filipino martial arts. Filipino martial arts really are based on principles. There's no set stances, for example. There's the techniques, as I've learned it. The techniques are really based on principle. Like, okay, you have 10 angles of attack. That's the gist of the system. There's 10 angles. So if you create and understand the principles of defending each one of those angles, and you understand the principles of how to attack on each of those angles, you're set. That's it. That's all there is to it, right? In essence. Now, of course, yes, practice and muscle memory and all that comes into play, and fluidity and such. But in essence, it's just a matter of defending 10 angles and of attacking 10 angles, and that's it. So it puts you light years ahead quickly. Same thing with the stuff I do now, EFT. If I get to the principle of why I'm tapping, will it look like everybody else when you begin? Yes, but then as I'm into the session and I'm in with the client, stuff gets changed depending on what's going on, because I understand the principles of what's happening. And I'll vacillate back and forth between different variations and such. And the same thing with hypnosis and NLP, because I understand the principles of what's going on. So if you want to be masterful at something, right? You just need to dig deep. What if? Understand the principles of what's going on, and apply it. Absorb what's useful and make it your own, right? And that could apply from anything from the healing arts, like I do, to martial arts, to teaching, to business, network marketing, whatever it is. Those keys will serve towards your growing towards a level of mastery. So that's my little rambling and musing for today. I hope it was somewhat useful to you, and I'll see you on the flip side. Take care.